Just to give you an example of what that may look like. If you're a believer here today and you're doubting the resurrection, I want to give you some evidences and see if this helps your belief. And then if you're a doubter here today, you're doubting the resurrection, I want to ask you, how is it that you explain these 5 facts? The 5 facts, you may not know these. These are whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or an agnostic or an atheist, anyone who studies ancient near history, anyone who looks at the first century and studies these facts, they agree to these 5 things. You do not have to be a Christian to agree to these 5 things. The question is, what hypothesis best explains these 5 facts? And the 5 facts are, number 1, that Jesus existed and He died a death by crucifixion. Whether you're an atheist or a Christian, they all believe in that fact. There are a minority of people who suggest that Jesus never existed, and they're such a minority and they're so radical that the scholastic community basically never entertains those theories. The majority of scholars believe this to be a fact, that Jesus existed and that He died a death by crucifixion. Fact number 2 is that the disciples of Jesus, the believers of Jesus, soon after His death, came to believe that He had been bodily risen from the dead. That's not to say that Jesus was bodily risen from the dead. It's just to say that the disciples of Jesus had a genuine belief that Jesus had been bodily raised from the dead. And you know that because they preached it. You can see it all through the book of Acts. You don't have to believe the Bible is the inspired word of God to agree that the disciples believed Jesus had been risen from the dead. There are extra biblical sources, other historical documents which support the fact that the disciples were preaching the resurrection of Jesus and that they were so committed to it that they were willing to die. They were willing to give their lives in profound and terrible ways. That's fact number 2. Fact number 3 is that the tomb was empty. The majority of historical scholars, whether you're an atheist or agnostic or Christian, cannot deny the historical evidence that points to the fact that the tomb of Jesus was empty. They still can't find it. They have a new History.com special or History Channel special every year trying to find the tomb of Jesus. Nobody can find it. The tomb was empty. That doesn't make the resurrection true, but you can't deny the fact that the tomb is empty. That's a supporting evidence for the resurrection. The other third fact is that the Apostle Paul, or the fourth fact is that the Apostle Paul, who was a persecutor of the church, someone who hated Christianity, a skeptic, suddenly converted to Christianity and became one of Christianity's most ardent supporters, planting churches all over the known world and writing half of the New Testament. How do you explain that? How do you explain the conversion of the Apostle Paul? The fifth evidence is James, the brother of Jesus. James went from being a skeptic, someone who did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah. I mean, what brother is going to want his older brother to be the Messiah, right? He goes from being a skeptic to an ardent believer, someone who is later called James the Just, someone who is a committed believer. How do you go from a tremendous skeptic like that to a sold-out believer like James? Those are the 5 facts. The death of Jesus on the cross, the belief of the disciples that He had been bodily risen from the dead, the empty tomb, the conversion of the Apostle Paul, who was a Christian hater, now he's a church planner, and same thing with James, the brother of Jesus, a skeptic, now a strong believer. How do you explain those 5 facts? Those are facts which support the resurrection hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. Well, some will say, Jesus didn't really die on the cross. That's what the Quran teaches, that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. The problem is that there is overwhelming historical evidence which says that He did. And even if Jesus didn't die on the cross, let's say that somehow He survived the crucifixion. How is it that a crucified Messiah, all bloodied up and beat up, is going to inspire the kind of courage and belief that these early disciples had to say that Jesus had been bodily risen from the dead? Why would they give their lives for what they knew to be a lie? See, martyrs make poor liars. So Jesus, that doesn't explain all the facts. Well, some will say, well, they were just hallucinating. They were seeing things. It was a vision. Here's the problem. There is zero documented evidence that anyone has ever, in the history of mankind, ever shared a hallucination. You can't, it's kind of like dreams. You ever had a dream and in your dream your wife actually liked you? And you wake up from the dream, and you say, honey, you like me in this dream, join me, let's like each other again. But you're sad, right? Because she can't do that. You can't share dreams. Same thing, you can't share hallucinations. They're individual. Any hallucination that anyone has experienced is usually individual. And the most likely people to hallucinate, guess who they are? They are people who have just lost a loved one who they eagerly desire to see again. That does not explain the conversion of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul did not want to see Jesus. He did not want to hallucinate. He did not lose a loved one, and neither did James. So it doesn't explain all the facts. In fact, you look at every naturalistic hypothesis. Every hypothesis besides the resurrection, they all have holes in their explanatory buckets. Every single one of them. I invite you to look. It's called a minimal facts case for the resurrection. If you're a believing person, embrace that doubt. Pursue the evidence for the resurrection. If you're a skeptical person, a doubting person, pursue the evidence, but doubt your doubts enough where you can be honest with the evidence, because the evidence points to the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. How do you explain the rapid growth of Christianity? Here are people, they weren't all believers. You had people in the first century who were severe doubters. Here, if you were a Jew, you certainly wouldn't want to believe Jesus to be God. Even his own disciples struggled with worshiping Jesus as God. If you were a Greek person, you wouldn't, the bodily resurrection from the dead is the furthest thing from your mind. That is such a category error. Even if you could be raised from the dead bodily, if you were a Greek person, you wouldn't want to do it because the Greeks believed in the immortality of the soul and that the body was just a prison you didn't want to come back to. And yet thousands of Greeks become believers. Why? Why the sudden shift? Why the sudden shift with Greeks? Why the sudden shift with Romans? Why the sudden shift with Jews? Imagine your most politically minded friend on Facebook. Okay, you know exactly who I'm talking about. That person on Facebook or email, always getting the chain emails, always getting the Facebook posts, especially around election time, and they're talking about Ron Paul, or they're all up in your business about George Bush, or they're big Obama supporters. Okay, you know who I'm talking about? Okay, I'm not saying that's wrong. You may be that person. But imagine you, if you're that person, or imagine your friend, if they're that person, suddenly switching sides. Imagine someone who was a big government liberal became a libertarian. You would go, whoa, what happened here? What kind of radical shift just happened? That is the same kind of shift that these Jews and Greeks and Romans experienced when they began to believe Jesus to be the Messiah, the risen Son of God. How do you explain that? How do you explain the evidences? All the naturalistic theories fail. The only theory that makes sense of all the facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And so if you're a believer, embrace your doubts, leverage your doubts, look for the evidence, have your faith strengthened. If you're a doubting person, doubt your doubts enough to be honest with the evidence. You may find that your doubts are not nearly as solid as you first imagined. And then you're exercising faith.